It is with absolute pleasure that I'm welcoming Mike Davis to our UMass Political Economy workshop today. My name is Isabella Weber and I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Economics Department here at UMass. I think probably Professor Davis doesn't really need an introduction. I'll still make my very humble short attempt, which is Professor Davis is a world-renowned historian, theorist, and also activist, distinguished professor emeritus of the University of California, Riverside, and amongst his many, many important books, I would only like to highlight three at this occasion. The Late Victorian Holocaust, then of course, The Monster at Our Door, The Global Threat of Avian Flu, which he published in 2005. Today, unfortunately, we can see the monster amongst us. So this is of a sad timeliness. And finally, his most recent book, which is Set the Night on Fire in the 1960s. The topic of Professor Davis' talk today is Trench Wars, Notes on the Election. So this is his analysis of the election and based on a New Left Review article that will be forthcoming shortly. Thank you so much for agreeing to join us. Thank you so much for joining our political economy workshop. We are all really thrilled to welcome you, and I cannot even mention how many messages I have received from students and colleagues who are filled with pleasure and excitement to welcome you today. So thank you so much for making the time. Professor Davis will present for about 30 minutes, and then part of the characteristic of this workshop is to have a pretty extensive discussion with the audience. So during the Q&A session, you will all have a chance to address questions via your video. In the meantime, feel free to use the chat for discussions amongst you. So Professor Davis, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. There's several people who are tuned into this who I'd much rather have them talk because they've been so influential in my own thinking. And normally, when I give talks, I never read papers. And if I talk too long, I always invite people in the audience to throw a tomato at me. But I'm not sure how you do that virtually. I don't know, maybe there's some tech person who knows that. And I am going to have to read from a paper. So my apologies. We assume that times of great social upheaval and human peril produce equally dramatic political reactions, New Deals, uprisings, counter-revolutions, civil war. Now, the one and only thing that most Americans agree about is that we're living in such a time. The greatest national crisis since 1932, or perhaps even since 1860, against a background of plague, impeachment, racist violence, and unemployment. One party espouses a vision of autocratized government and a return to the happy days of the white republic. The other offers a sentimental journey back to the multicultural centrism of the Obama era. Both parties are backward-looking, solipsistic, and unanchored in economic reality. But the first echoes the darkest side of modern history. The vote held on a day when over 100,000 Americans tested positive for COVID-19 was supposed to deliver a definitive verdict on Donald Trump. Indeed, the president's increasingly frenetic attempts to delegitimize the election seemed to signal his apprehension of a Democratic landslide. In the event, a projected 160 million ballots were mailed in or cast in person. This was the highest proportional turnout in probably about 120 years, and we expected a stunning judgment. Instead, the election results are a virtual photocopy of the 2016 outcome. All the disasters of the last 4 years appear to barely move the needle. Biden eked out a slim victory, in some states only by microscopic margins, that won him 306 electoral votes, exactly the total that Trump won in 2016. A mere 256,000 votes in 5 key states purchased 73 of those electoral votes. Meanwhile, much of his popular vote majority, which I think is about 6 million now, much of that, just like Clinton's previous 3 million popular majority, was simply wasted in blue trash bins like California, Massachusetts, and New York, without any effect on the electoral total. Despite an enormous campaign treasury, the Biden campaign only really struck fire or converged with the existing popular movements. Stacey Abrams' Fair Fight, an extraordinary voter coalition in Georgia, Lucha, Living United for Change in Arizona, which was a Latino and labor united front, built during the long struggle against the neo-fascist regime of Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Maricopa County. On the other hand, the Democratic infantry, the thousands of union members who traditionally go door to door for the party, were on the whole stood down. Individual unions, of course, like Nurses United, AFT, the Las Vegas Culinary Workers, and other locals of Unite Here, undoubtedly made decisive contributions in specific states, but the national union profile was the lowest in modern times. The Trump camp, in contrast, unleashed hordes of unmasked megachurch members on the suburbs, while the liberal media was focused on the unnerving spectacles of Trump's virus-spewing mega rallies. A huge grassroots campaign, financed by his billionaire allies, was rousing old supporters and adding new ones to the ranks. The effort increased his 2016 vote by more than 8 million and preserved his 2016 winning margins in three key battleground states, Iowa, Ohio, and Florida, that Obama had won in 2012 and Biden was hoping to recapture. Democrats now have to wonder whether these important purple states will not now turn convincingly red. Meanwhile, the down ticket results were disastrous for those expecting a landslide. On the eve of the election, the Democratic House Campaign Committee was boasting that it would enlarge the party's delegation by 10, 15, even 20 seats. Instead, they appeared to have lost about 10, leaving them with only a fragile majority. They also failed to win a single one of the 27 congressional races that the New York Times had labeled as toss-ups. Moderate Democrats in the so-called Blue Dog Caucus, who had won seats in 2018, were the principal victims. The chair of the campaign committee, Sherry Bustos, who's a Democrat from Illinois, admitted that she felt gutted by the losses, while Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez flailed the committee for its once again being so incompetent in using the digital media. The billion-dollar Democratic crusade to reclaim control of the Senate also dismally failed expectations, producing only one victory and leading to the strange outcome that the body's future will be decided by 2 runoff elections in Georgia. Democrats haven't won a runoff election of any kind in that state for 30 years. However, if they do defy the odds and win control, Mitch McConnell, the most ruthless and successful Senate leader since LBJ, can savor his extraordinary accomplishment of filling every single vacancy in the federal judiciary, from district courts to the Supreme Courts, with bona fide members of the right-wing Federalist Society. He's locked the federal court doors against Democrats for a generation and thrown away the keys. Since this is a census year, state legislative and judicial races have a special importance. Although California and 5 other states have delegated the job of redrawing state and congressional boundaries to independent commissions, legislatures still retain this power elsewhere. And over the last 30 years, the right has built an extraordinary infrastructure to support state-level political campaigns and promote the passage of right-wing legislation, particularly laws restricting labor, abortion, and voting rights. This infrastructure has 3 institutional components: 60 free market policy institutes in all 50 states, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, which disseminates model right-wing legislation and helps Republicans write bills, and Americans for Prosperity, demiurge of the Tea Party movement, founded by the Koch brothers in 2004, which channels torrents of dark money into state campaigns. In the 2010 midterm, following a carefully developed strategy, the Republicans won 680 new legislative seats, the control of 54 chambers, and the resulting power to redraw district boundaries. The rewards of gerrymandering, according to the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, are greatest in states with close partisan divisions, where over 1/3 of the seats can swing purely as a function of gerrymanders. Accordingly, Republicans in 2011 used state-of-the-art software to gerrymander key battleground states such as Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Wisconsin. These Republican state house majorities have proven almost unassailable. This year, the blue wave merely lapped gently against this red fortress, then quickly receded, leaving behind the loss of the New Hampshire legislature to Republicans. With the defeat of Democratic governors in Montana and New Hampshire, the Republicans now have trifectas, control of both houses of the legislature and the governor's seat in 23 states. They've also increased their majorities on state Supreme Courts, who are the final arbiters of the constitutionality of redistricting plans. New gerrymanders are now inevitable. If the Republicans retain the Senate as they're favored to do, it's hard to imagine a worse balance of power for the incoming Biden administration, its legislative agenda, and that of the progressive one. Larry Cohen, the former president of the Communication Workers Union, who now chairs Our Revolution, the outreach arm of the Sanders campaign, was uncompromisingly blunt. Quote, "For those of us who focus on governance and economic and social justices, this election is a dismal rubber stamp of the unacceptable status quo. Black, brown, and white working class Americans see their hopes of real reform evaporate for now, even while cheering the victory over Trump." To understand how the Democrats arrived at such a hollow victory, it's useful to begin with an examination of voting dynamics in strategic constituencies, comparing the outcomes to 2012, 2016. And I'm going to offer 2, and if time permits, 3 case studies. The first is called Down in the Valley. For 30 years, Texas, with its 5 million conservative voters and 38 electoral votes, has been the great powerhouse of far-right post-Reagan Republicanism. Here, dark money is literally pumped out of wells to fund right-wing operations and campaigns in every corner of the country, especially when combined with Florida's 29 electoral votes. Texas has been the counterweight to California's liberal Leviathan. But demographic change, or potentialized by activism, has been slowly eroding this hegemony. Anglos, that is non-Hispanic whites, became a minority at the beginning of the millennium, and fully 40% of the population in 2010 census identified as Latino, Tejanos for the most part. 1 out of 8 Texans are African American, and a huge in-migration of new immigrants, from farm workers to software engineers, has added to the state's kaleidoscopic diversity. Meanwhile, Austin, whose youthful cultural energy exceeds that of any major city, except possibly New York, has become the most important tech center between Silicon Valley and Boston. And last March, delivered 84,000 primary votes for Bernie Sanders. So the Republican Party in Texas is highly mobilized, one might even say militarized, to prevent or postpone the transformation of this new demography into a Democratic majority. Its odd ally has been the Democratic National Committee, which for years has ignored Texas, despite appeals from local Democrats that major investments in voter registration and community organization could shift the balance of power in the state and in the whole country. Their argument was fortified by Beto O'Rourke's 2018 campaign for Ted Cruz, which made up in grassroots energy for whatever it lacked in cash. Republicans laughed off the challenge in the beginning, but sweated heavily in the home stretch when polls showed the candidates neck and neck. A large injection of cash from energy industry political action committees ultimately saved the day for Cruz. The Democrats reveled in the closeness of the outcome, 50.9 versus Beto's 48.3. This year, national Democratic money, much of it from Michael Bloomberg, by the way, has spent $1 billion personally on his primary campaigns and then on the Biden campaign. This money arrived at the last minute to support a Beto-designed campaign that focused on 10 heavily gerrymandered Republican districts, mainly in the suburbs of metropolitan Dallas-Fort Worth, that Beto had won back in 2018. Flipping 9 of them would give Democrats control of the Texas House for the first time in a generation. Misleading polls in October, and by controlling the House, thus preventing a new Republican gerrymander. In the event, Republicans retained all the seats, and Trump, though his margin was reduced, easily won. The Texas Observer, the state's unique progressive magazine, concluded that, quote, one of the biggest takeaways from the election is that there's a clear ceiling for Democrats in growing suburbs. Now, Republican dominance of the state remains unfettered, as is their ability to lock in their majorities for years to come in the next redistricting cycle. The one-size-fits-all suburban template that was used by the Biden campaign in Texas and almost everywhere else ignored the consensus view of veteran campaign strategists from both parties that the real key to swinging the state is the mobilization of the so-called sleeping Latino majority in South Texas, particularly in the 7 major border counties where 90% of the population is of Mexican origin. This was actually acknowledged 2 days before the election when DNC Chair Tom Perez made a last-minute visit to the McAllen area. Quote, the road to the White House, he declared, goes through South Texas. Remember, Beto lost by about 200,000 votes in 2018. We can make these votes up alone in the Rio Grande Valley. If we take Latino turnout from 40 to 50%, that's enough to flip Texas. The heavily Democratic border is one of the poorest regions in the country, heavily dependent on agriculture and NAFTA trade, with the population routinely vilified by Republican propaganda as aliens and rapists. The Biden campaign seems to believe that this anti-Trump sentiment alone would add another 100,000 votes along the border without having to divert campaign resources from the suburbs. A blue wave along the Rio Grande from El Paso to Brownsville was taken for granted. However, when the fog of battle dissipated on Wednesday, Democrats were stunned to discover that high turnout had instead propelled a Trump surge along the border. In the three Rio Grande Valley counties, this is the agricultural corridor from Brownsville to Rio Grande City, which, by the way, is the only region in America that actually had a revolution in the 20th century. The Plan de San Diego, which was an extension of the Mexican Revolution, led by anarchists, followers of the Magon brothers, the famous Mexican anarchists. An incredible history of resistance in the Rio Grande Valley. Clinton carried this by 40%, Biden only by 15%. More than half the population of Starr County, an ancient battlefield of the Texas farm workers movement, lives in poverty. Yet Trump won 47% of the vote, an incredible gain in 28% since 2016. Further upriver, he actually flipped the 82% Latino Valverde County, that's Del Rio, as well as Zapata County, which had voted Republican since the end of Reconstruction. In addition, he increased his vote in Maverick County, that's the Eagle Pass area, by 24%, and the Laredo area, Webb County, by 15%. Representative Vicente Gonzalez had to fight down to the wire to save the seat he'd won by 21% in 2018. Even in El Paso, a hotbed of Democratic activism, Trump made a 6% gain. Considering South Texas as a whole, Democrats had great hopes of winning the 21st congressional district. This is the corridor that connects Austin and San Antonio, as well as the 78% Latino 23rd, which is anchored in the western suburbs of San Antonio, but encompasses a huge swath of southwestern Texas. In both cases, the Republicans easily won. The explanation for the Trump surge? As Congressman Filemon Velez, who's a Democrat from Brownsville, bitterly complained to Harlingen newspaper, I think there was no Democratic national organizational effort in South Texas, and the results showed. The visits are nice, but without a planned media and grassroots strategy, you can't sway voters. When you take voters for granted, like National Democrats have done in South Texas for 40 years, there are consequences to pay. Quote. But the border was equally neglected by Clinton in 2017, so there must be some additional variables involved here. Some suggest the right to life Catholicism, the appointment of Comey Barrett, generated extra enthusiasm for Trump, while others point to the fact that ICE is a major employer in these counties, some cases the only high-wage employer. Fear of a refugee wave swamping border counties might also have been a factor, along with Obrador's strange bromance with Trump. Now, the Republicans energetically mined such inclinations, but I doubt this was decisive. More important were several other trends rooted in the region's political economy and class dynamics that favored insurgents both on the right and on the left. First, NAFTA, as well as the shale oil boom in the Laredo area, has greatly expanded the entrepreneurial class in border counties. Independent truckers, shipping agents, warehouse foremen, oil and gas subcontractors, car dealers, and the like, whose natural magnetic orientation is Republican, since the border economy is capitalized on poverty and minimum wages. This group has a keen interest in opposing a higher minimum wage or a pro-union labor department. Republicans have avidly responded to new opportunities to recruit leadership from this dynamic stratum. In its 2014 campaign, Republican Governor Greg Abbott made no less than 20 different trips to the valley. Although Trump initially threatened their livelihoods with his threat to withdraw from NAFTA, The 2018 treaty revisions, which left the status quo largely in place, freed the Tejano business community to vote its wallet. I should point out that nationally, the Latino share of the middle class, and this is whatever the Brookings Institution defines it, has grown from 5% in 1979 to 18% last year. In contrast, the Black share has only increased by 3% in 40 years, from 9% to 12%. But there's another side of the ledger we need to look at. The spectacular wave of support in South Texas for Bernie Sanders during March's Super Tuesday primary. After the withdrawal of San Antonio's favorite son, Julian Castro, at the beginning of January, rank and file Tejano Democrats rallied to Sanders with 200 young Latino organizers working full-time for his national staff. Sanders was able to speak to Valley communities with a passionately informed voice. As was the case with the Nevada caucuses in February, radicalized Latino youth and their working class families embraced his platform of universal health care, free public education, a $15 minimum wage, and pathways to citizenship for undocumented populations. Sanders ended up sweeping the entire border from Brownsville to El Paso, as well as Metro San Antonio and Austin, winning 626,000 votes, 99 convention delegates, and 30% of the votes cast, just 5 points behind Biden. The Sanders campaign was also an uprising against a conservative Democratic machine led by old Poles like Representative Henry Cuellar of Laredo, who's a former customs broker belonging to the Blue Dog caucus, who frequently votes with Republicans. Jessica Cisneros, a 26-year-old human rights attorney, backed by Sanders and the progressive organization Justice Democrats, came very close to beating him in March. Biden's nomination and Cuellar's narrow victory were twin disappointments that deflated the enthusiasm of Sanders voters, ratifying the perception that centrist Democrats gave no priority for fighting for the interests of the border working class. Spanish surname people, and of course, the biggest minority in the United States, and this year surpassed African Americans as the second largest pool of eligible voters. Their electoral clout will only increase amongst the first wave of Generation Z eligible voters, 18 to 23. Latinos constituted 22%, Blacks 14%. In the Bush years, many Republican strategists in the Sun Belt, having read the demographic tea leaves, argued that culturally conservative Latinos were the key to building a new and more durable Republican majority. Mainstream Democratic leadership, however, has never endorsed a similar vision and continues to treat Latinos as second-class citizens within the party hierarchy who automatically vote Democrat. The exclusion of Julian Castro from the speaker's platform at the virtual convention in August was interpreted in the Spanish language media as salt rubbed in an old wound. Now, the Democrats have other neglected or abandoned constituencies, including Puerto Rico and Appalachia, but South Texas has unique strategic importance. Isabella, how much time do I have left?
You have 10 more minutes. Just take your time.
Okay, I'm going to skip over the second case study, which is called Leaving the Rust on the Rust Belt. And we're going to the land of lumpen billionaires. Now, the great Republican upset was not Trump's slim victory in 2016, but following this, his rapid takeover and ruthless cleansing of the GOP in 2017, 2018. No one, as far as I know, predicted this, especially in face of the impressive range of his intra-party opponents, which included the Bush dynasty, old Reaganites like John McCain and Mitt Romney, even for a season, the party's own club Jacobin, the Freedom Caucus. Many were appalled by his willingness to unleash the alt-right against the campaign of any Republican who hesitated to pledge unconditional obedience to the White House, and dozens eventually chose early retirements. Trump's nuclear advantage, of course, was his astounding popularity at the base, a frenzy routinely stoked by evangelical leaders, Fox News, and of course his endless tweets. Suddenly, the America depicted by the Occupy movement as the people versus the greed of the 1% was unmasked as something entirely different, a confused majority facing the militant and intransigent 40%. It's the Trump base, worshipful, fanatic, imperious to reason, that has made Trump so scary to the majority. If they live in big cities and depend on CNN and the New York Times to access reality in the red states, Trump rallies most likely define their image of the other America. Big, angry, ignorant white people in MAGA hats baying at the moon or beating up journalists. In the liberal press, they read that Trumpdom is rural and small town America, self-transformed into a third right with a declining white proletariat in tow. Now, for me, this recalls the booba phenomena in the civil rights era, where Southern defenders of Jim Crow were always depicted as tobacco-chewing good old boys who worked at gas stations or lounged menacingly in front of country stores. As Diane McWhorter demonstrated in her brilliant history of the Birmingham Freedom Movement, the boobas, as well as Bull Connor's brutal cops, were just hired hands of the city's country club elite, including her own wealthy Klan-supporting father, the true enemy of racial justice, the city's white bourgeoisie. Similarly, to understand contemporary far-right republicanism, it's necessary to look behind its populist facade to see how power is actually configured. Two social landscapes are particularly important for such an investigation. First, the micropolises, smaller non-union, culturally conservative cities in the South and Midwest. And secondly, exurbia, the affluent white migration into rural counties at the edge of major metropolises. The country hicks wearing John Deere caps who swooned for Trump on camera are only bit actors in this drama. If Reagan came to power aligned with the historic anti-union offensive led by the Business Roundtable, an unprecedented coalition of Fortune 500 corporations, Trump came to the White House thanks to the love of Jesus and a motley crew of what my good friend Sam Farber has referred to as the lumpen billionaires. Although defense contractors, the energy industry, and big pharma pay their dues to the White House, as is always the case when Republicans are in power, the donor coalition that financed the revolt against Obama, and then after the defeat of Cruz in the primaries, united behind Trump, is largely peripheral to the traditional sites of economic power. In addition to the family dynasties mainly based on oil wealth, like the Kochs, who've been around since the days of Goldwater and the John Birch Society, Trump's key allies are post-industrial robber barons from inland places like Grand Rapids, Wichita, Little Rock, and Tulsa, whose fortunes derive from real estate, private equity, casinos, and services ranging from private armies to chain usury. A vivid example of their world is Cleveland, not the fated Grand Dam on the Cayuga, but the seat of Bradley County, Tennessee. A low to medium income city of 43,000 east of Chattanooga, it is what the census now dubs a micropolitan statistical area. Over 90% white and emphatically evangelical, with 200 Protestants but only one Catholic church. Cleveland fits the red America stereotype with almost cartoonish perfection, thanks to Tennessee's emergence as the hub of the Southeastern Auto Corridor, and particularly to the big VW plant in nearby Chattanooga, it's attracted a surprising number of new factories, especially auto parts manufacturers, all of them basking under Tennessee's low tax rates and right to work law. This year, Trump won 77% of the vote, exactly the same as he did in 2016. Unusual for a town its size, Cleveland has 2 billionaires in residence, both Trump beneficiaries as well as contributors. One is Forrest L. Preston, whose net worth is about $2 billion, who owns Life Care Centers of America, the largest nursing home chain in the country with 220 facilities in 28 states and 30,000 employees. The long-term care industry collects most of its income from Medicaid and Medicare. And Life Care was accused by a whistleblower of routinely filing false claims, keeping patients in facilities longer than necessary, and charging for totally unnecessary procedures. Faced with the possibility of prosecution, Preston agreed 2017 to pay back $146 million to the Justice Department. The whistleblower additionally alleged that Preston was purposely bleeding the company dry and leaving it severely undercapitalized. Together with the other major chains, mostly owned by private equity companies, Life Care cuts costs by violating state and federal regulations about protective equipment, infection training, and sanitation standards. The Trump administration punctually came to the industry's aid by eliminating an Obama requirement for homes to have at least one part-time infection technician and drastically reduce fines for non-compliance, in effect subsidizing continued criminal negligence. The first major US COVID-19 outbreak, as you'll recall, occurred in Life Care's facility in Kirkland, Washington, a suburb of Seattle. The management waited 2 weeks before notifying public health officials of its growing cluster of pneumonia cases. And then, after coronavirus was identified, concealed the number of infections and casualties, refusing to give any information to frantic families, and forcing staff to work for weeks without proper protection. By the beginning of summer, 45 patients, workers, and people who had contact with the staff had died from COVID-19. Numerous other Life Care homes, unable or unwilling to practice effective infection control measures, also registered frightening death counts. 17 dead in the Neshoba Valley Center outside Boston, 8 dead in Omaha, 5 in Hilo, and in the home state of Tennessee, at least 14 dead in McMinn County, 17 dead in Hamlin County, and so on. By the way, on its website, which you should access, the company offers the consoling message, dealing with death and the joy that awaits. More recently, it's built a small memorial to its heroic employees, dead employees, at its Cleveland headquarters. Now, CBS is 60 Minutes, PBS is Frontline, the Washington Post, the New York Times, all produce exposés about Life Care centers. But the Trump administration and Republican state governments have aggressively shielded and the rest of the industry from prosecution. During the first 6 months of the crisis, federal inspectors from Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services routinely absolved facilities for flagrant violations of infection control regulations. And at least 18 Republican states have granted them at least limited immunity from lawsuits related to pandemic deaths. McConnell and the Senate majority, meanwhile, have made blanket immunity for nursing homes and hospitals a condition for progress on the stimulus bills. Instead of fines or indictments, Life Care centers receive $48 million in pandemic relief funds. By election eve across the country, more than 100,000 people had died in nursing homes. And infections right now, again spiraling out of control, with staff continuing to work without adequate protective gear. LifeShare's share of the carnage is unknown since it refuses to release figures, but the reputational damage has been severe. As its profit centers turn into mortuaries, Preston has doubled down on his longtime avoidance of the press and unwanted publicity. Not so for his neighbor and Cleveland's other billionaire, Alan Jones, whose extravagant lifestyle and personality overflows Cleveland in all seasons. Jones owns Check Into Cash, the second largest payday loan company in the country, with 1,200 locations in 32 states. In fact, he's widely considered to be the father of payday credit. So if you've lost your wallet or purse with all your cash, Jones will lend you $200 if you agree to pay back $230 next payday. If you still can't pay all of that on time, they'll happily lend you more on the same terms. And soon you'll wake up in a world of pain. Usury is supposed to be illegal, and most states have put a maximum cap on interest. But Jones pays politicians to bend the law for him. Not bribes under the table, but full press campaigns mounted by an army of overweight lobbyists. His home state has been particularly kind to him, and usury, redefined, allows him to live next to Preston in an oversized French chateau modeled after the famous Vanderbilt estate, with a second home and horse ranch outside of Jackson, Wyoming. In an interview with the Huffington Post, he was asked why Cleveland had such a small Black population, less than half the statewide average. He replied, "Well, we have just enough Blacks to put together a decent basketball team, but not so many that the good people of Cleveland, Tennessee need to worry about crime. That's why I can leave my keys in the car with the door unlocked," quote. In 2017, he became a hero to President Trump and Fox News when he yanked his company's ads off NFL primetime. Quote, "When I see Colin Kaepernick lecturing the press wearing a Fidel Castro t-shirt, you realize the hypocrisy to this stupidity. I love America. Our companies will not condone unpatriotic behavior." I'm going to leave it at that. There's much more, but I've taken more than that time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for mapping the trench war, its structures, geography, and protagonists for us. I will now open up for questions from the audience. So you all have a chance to address questions to Professor Davis. If you would like to ask a question, please post stack in the chat box, and I will then call upon you and will ask you to, if this is convenient for you, turn on your video and directly address your question. In case you have any impediments, you can post your question in the chat box and I will read it to Professor Davis on your behalf. So if you would like to ask a question, please post stack in the chat box. I see that there's one first question by a PhD student, Evan Vosner. Evan, would you like to go?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks so much for that talk. That was really interesting. And I think, yeah, like the case study, well, the case studies that you mentioned are really illuminating, and I'm really interested in the other one as well. And with regards to the first one, I'm wondering about, there seems to be this sort of longer term trend of the Democrats for so long had a base in a voting base of people in labor unions, and generally had, if you were in a very general broad sense, if you were sort of lower income and had less education, you were more likely to vote Democrat. And that's now changed since the 2016 election nationally. Now, if you are lower income, you're not more likely to vote Democrat. And actually, like these days, the Democrats have 41 of the top 50 wealthiest congressional districts in the US. And the Republicans are more and more winning the poorest districts in the U.S. And on top of that, I mean, yeah, you mentioned that the Democrats kind of took it for granted that, oh, if we have a large Latino turnout, that they're all going to go vote Democrats, but we see that didn't happen. And I wonder if maybe you might have, we're going to bring up this statistic, which is that in Ohio, in 2020, Trump won union workers by a pretty significant margin. I think nationally, Biden still won the vote of union workers, but in a Rust Belt city like that, the Republicans are gaining ground. And I guess my question is, I wonder if you sort of perceive this sort of new alignment where the Democrats are becoming more and more sort of the party of elites, the party of the party of capital, whereas the Republicans, and I think there are many instances now where certain people are trying to explicitly say that the Republicans should try to become, I mean, in some kind of odd, of course, probably fraudulent sense, but it's like people have been saying, oh, the Republicans should become a party of a diverse, multicultural working class. I guess I'm wondering what your take is on all of that.
Well, first of all, back in 2016, I picked out 15 counties anchored by small, medium-sized industrial cities organized by the CIO in the 1930s. They voted at least once, but in most cases twice, for Obama. And in all these counties, there had been a shift to Trump. So to understand that, I went back and I read newspapers or looked at television in each of those counties for a couple of years before the election. And in every case correlated with significant job losses, plant closures, some of them totally calamitous. And the truth is that Hillary Clinton had almost nothing to say to people there. Trump was able to connect in a direct way with his promises about reindustrialization and running against China. I looked at those counties again last week. I have very little shift. Biden won Erie, the major industrial town in western Pennsylvania. He lost Mahoning County in Ohio, Youngstown. But on the whole, it was more or less the same vote, preserved the same margins as 2016. Because, the Democrats have been unable for a generation or more to answer the simple question that folks around the dinner table in Dubuque or Laredo or Erie would ask them, which is, what are you going to do concretely to increase job opportunity and economic stability here in this town, in this regions? Of course, the Democrats aren't alone in not being able to answer that question. You see in Europe, Labour Party unable to answer the same questions in the north of England, or social democratic parties in the north of France, Tuscany, Eastern Germany, and so on. Yet I must point out that in this election, according to polling, the exit polling, which all the major networks use, Biden won the majority of vote from people who make under $100,000 a year. Trump won the above $100,000 vote. Certainly, in places like Silicon Valley, Hollywood, maybe in the upper east side of New York, very rich people voting Democratic. But often this talk about the working class really means just the white working class. And it doesn't even mean all the white working class. It doesn't take into account, for instance, people like nurses, okay, or Amazon workers. I mean, Black and Latino workers, particularly women, Black and Latino workers, voted overwhelmingly for the Democrats. What they'll get in return from that is uncertain. I think any serious analysis of 2016, and I think this will be confirmed today, is that Trump's victory was not some major realignment of social forces, but rather by giving ownership of the Republican platform to the Christian right and then faithfully following along in it, he was able to reclaim the majority of the Romney vote, almost all the Romney vote. He didn't improve on it, but that eventually came to his side. That's really how he won the election. The idea of this blue-collar whites by the hundreds of thousands voting for Trump, I don't think holds water. And finally, of course, I mean, the one thing you're absolutely right about is that you have to understand this election in terms of the big defeats of American unionism in the last 4 years, in the last decade. Of course, in some cases, in healthcare, for instance, amongst teachers, you've seen fantastic struggles. I mean, look at teachers in West Virginia say. But the failure of the UAW to organize the half of the American auto industry that's now based in Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, and Mississippi, I think has huge consequences, just as any success in unionizing this region will also have huge positive consequences. But I don't think we should take any of the kind of hyperbole about the elections entirely seriously until we've disaggregated and looked at it in case studies. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you for the question and your answer. David Kotz is next on the list. If you would like to ask a question, please post stack in the chat box. David?
Thank you, Mike, for a very interesting presentation. Based on your analysis, what do you think should be the left stance toward the incoming Biden administration in early 2021?
Well, there's, I mean, the progressive Democrats, of course, have a solid, very detailed platform. The problem is that it really depended on a Biden sweep, a landslide, to push that in Congress. For the left itself, I think some old truths, once again, have been reaffirmed, particularly about jobs and income. Now, if you look at the Trump vote, he won about 72 million votes. In the opinion polls, he has averaged 40% popularity. He's the only American president who's never had a majority on his side, but he has a rock solid 40%. Well, if you take, I mean, admittedly, this is not a scientific exercise, but if you apply 40% to 17 million and consider that to be the core Trump vote, which, like this kind of horrible story from a nurse in South Dakota whose patient's dying of coronavirus but refused to admit it even exists. If you take that 40% and consider that's, you know, a kind of lost vote in America, it still leaves you with 17 million people who voted for Trump who aren't part of the hardcore. Now, the reason I think that economics is so important in that 17 million is because Biden and the Democrats in the congressional campaigns failed so miserably to weld the issue of jobs and a national strategy for fighting coronavirus together. Trump's strategy beginning in late April, when he started unleashing the armed mobs on state houses and shouting, you know, liberate Wisconsin, liberate Michigan. It was obvious that his strategy was to separate the two things as much as possible, make it into a kind of Sophie's choice of either, you know, public health and a coronavirus strategy or your jobs and your income. Biden had every opportunity to undermine this and put forward his own procedure. I mean, one instance is back in April when you had this huge revolt of healthcare workers and Amazon warehouse employees and so on. You know, tens of thousands of people protesting or even going out and strike. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren responded avidly to that, giving not only their support, but coming up with legislation to support the protests. Biden said nothing. He was still hiding in his basement in Delaware. More recently, in the battle over the so-called HEROES Act, the new stimulus bill, this should have been something that the Democrats took to the grassroots, mobilized unions, community groups, spent a lot of advertising on. The Republicans are holding up and preventing the stimulus bill. They're driving you into poverty. When Trump unexpectedly went around the Senate and came to Pelosi, and Munchkin said to Pelosi, we'll give you $2 trillion. I think they should have accepted that. That's a view of, by the way, many people on the left. Because even though it was a grandstanding stunt by the White House, it would have completely turned the tables on McConnell in the Senate, because McConnell repeatedly said he's intransigent. He will not allow a big stimulus bill, and his miniature version has to be contoured to support basically the Trump donor base and big hospitals and the like. But Pelosi conducted the negotiations by herself. She totally excluded progressives in Congress from weighing in on this. And then she decided to let McConnell bottle up the whole thing and not to accept Trump's theatrical offer, obviously in the belief that this would undermine the Republicans. It didn't. In fact, it made Trump look like he cared more about jobs than the Democrats did. So you ended up in this zero-sum choice election where the Democrats are the party of, excuse me, Democrats ran on coronavirus and on the criminal negligence of the Trump administration. But Trump was able to run on jobs. And the third quarter job reports, in fact, showed something that looked like a fairly impressive recovery. In October, 640,000 new jobs were added, although half of them are in retail and other industries, restaurants and so on, which are now being shut down all across the country. But still, it looked impressive. They simply did not fight the battle that needed to be fought. And they allowed the two issues of the recession and the pandemic to become counterposed. I can't imagine anything more stupid. Justice Democrats is, as you know, which has come out of the Sanders campaign, have been very articulate in condemning that, basically saying the Democrats had no job program. And of course, this exacerbates the internal social and class divisions inside the Democratic Party.
Thank you so much. I have Christopher Zimmermann next on the list, and I forgot to ask you all to please introduce yourself with a word before you ask a question, and please keep your questions brief and to the point. Christopher Zimmermann, are you there?
Yes, hello. Thank you. Mike Davis, thank you for this, and thank you for your incredible body of work over the years. Amazing. My question, I'm wondering what you think this sort of incredible polarization of American politics, this sort of trench warfare, in what way is it sort of a symptom of a way of sort of deflecting the deeper antagonisms at work in capital? I mean, I'm thinking of what Noam Chomsky says about the US system is essentially a one-party system with two factions. we see this left, right, this kind of fighting when in fact, there's sort of deeper antagonisms that we're not attending to because we're fighting amongst ourselves. I mean, this is the kind of classical idea of, racism as mobilized to allow capital to sort of propagate in a sense. So I guess my question is, can we think and act outside of the trenches? And what role does the theorist, does the activist have in this dynamic?
Well, first of all,
I hope that makes sense.
thank you. First of all, we have to ask who dug the trenches and how deep they are. And there's an interesting piece in the forthcoming issue of Foreign Affairs where two authors argue that internationally, comparatively, this is an exceptional state. And the gridlock has become the default condition of American politics. But what makes it exceptional is the fact that race, culture, economic positions are stacked on top of each other. Whereas in other countries, often these things are separated. So you have people who, are very concerned about immigration, but they remain, strong union members. That's also the case in the United States, by the way. The Rust Belt counties that I looked at, the ones who stayed for Trump, all had much larger Democratic votes for local Democrats, pro-union Democrats. So there's split voting is not supposed to exist in this country anymore, but it does, particularly in former or currently unionized areas where people are working out the choices. I think that there are really three parties in the United States. The third party has the dilemma of trying to figure out how to stay in the Democratic Party, with the Democratic Party refusing to support the absolute essential demands, the demands that are essential to, American people. It also has the problem that, like any left that comes to power, this tends to demobilize its base. Bernie promised that the movement would flow in two channels equally, as union and social movements on the outside and the campaign movement. They would reinforce each other. But in fact, what happened after Super Tuesday was that the political campaign seemed to be all that was around. And that had become a matter of just electing Democrats. There's huge disappointment amongst the ranks of the Sanders campaign. And it was only thanks to Black Lives Matter that their activism was recycled and kept alive. I fear very much what may happen now. So everything has to be built, in a sense, on the outside. And though it's obviously tremendously important to elect progressives to office, it cannot ever be the primary, the primary goal. As to whether you can detach a significant part of Trump's support, well, I think Sanders campaigns and the generation before that, the Rainbow Coalition, under Jesse Jackson, showed that it could. Surprising resonance in places like Idaho or, in white industrial towns. But on the whole, the polarization isn't a political or cultural polarization. It's a class polarization. And what I try to show in this article is that the Trump movement is not a movement of disaffected white workers, now joined by a surprising number of Black and Latino workers. It has in many ways the classical characteristics of 1920s and 30s authoritarian movements, fascist movement. It's especially a middle-class phenomena. And if I'd continued to do it on, I would have switched to the question of the exurbs. There's something like more than 30 million Americans now live in areas outside the suburbs, on the outer periphery of metropolitan areas, counties, rural counties that are amenity or recreation rich, but they're no longer rural counties in any kind of traditional sense. Wealthy Republicans who don't want to live in places that Blacks or Latinos might control. This is kind of the off world, to use Blade Runner terminology, of American politics. The one final point, the one thing we should learn from everything that's happened in Western Europe and the United States is that the traditional middle classes, the middle classes who derive their income from some level of exploitation of other people or from property, are a massive bloc who have shown that they have no intention of surrendering any privilege, or for that matter, political power to the other side. And there's a survey that was done by distinguished social political scientists in January, and he polled Republicans, and he found out that the majority agreed with the he asked this question, is it sometimes necessary to pick up arms? Is it sometimes necessary to take things in hand, whatever the election results? And a very terrifying, I thought, majority of Republicans agreed with that sentiment. So this is kind of Civil War served cold, if you will.
Thank you so much. I have Devika Dutt, a PhD student from the economics department, next on my list. Devika, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you, Professor Davis. That was a really fascinating talk. And I really have a very simple question. I guess I'm not from the United States. I'm not an American. And during this election, I had to fight a lot with a lot of my progressive American friends to convince them to vote for Joe Biden after like a real progressive candidate was no longer really, on the table anymore. And I'm wondering, like, what is the prospect for the future? Where do we go from here in terms of like not only electoral politics, but broadly progressive politics in the United States, given that it has implications for literally everybody else in the rest of the world? And how do we ensure that you can actually have a progressive movement which can also be in power? Because, like right now, my only argument for all of my friends was, hey, you need to elect Joe Biden so that at least we don't have a fascist in the White House. And it's like, it's an easier fight, hopefully, to fight against, say, a neoliberal person who's sitting in the White House as opposed to a right-wing nationalist. But where do we go from here? Is it feasible to think of a takeover of the Democratic Party by, say, Democratic Socialists or Justice Democrats, given that Bernie Sanders couldn't do it so far, and like he ran a very successful-ish campaign, I would think. So yeah, that's really my question. Where do we go from here? Or do we have to settle for, and I don't know if you have the time to constantly settle for the lesser evil, like a Democrat like Joe Biden, given that, the clock is ticking on ecological crises and all other kinds of crises that we're dealing with today. I would really love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
No, I don't believe the Democratic Party can be transformed into a powerful instrument of emancipation and liberation at all. Which is why the dilemma of progressive Democrats and the squad is in some ways really acute. If there'd been a landslide, they would have had more to work with. They did very well in the elections. They added new people like Cori Bush to Congress. But it's very unlikely that they'll have the means to conduct successful struggles. I mean, they may win programs here and there. They may get a cabinet appointment, but this is a restoration that's gone on in the Democratic Party. This is complete continuity. I mean, Biden ran on the same strategy that Hillary Clinton ran on, focused on the suburbs, with only the amendment that he did appear and spend money on the 3 industrial states he lost. But in many ways, it's the same. To me, the biggest challenge to the left right now is that the movements we've seen, Black Lives Matter, the Sanders campaign, and so many local struggles, have involved extraordinary young people of color, particularly young women of color. I think that the central challenge is we need organizations of organizers. And you can interpret that every way, from Leninist parties to Acorn. But organizations that can create niches that allow poor kids, inner city people, to make lifelong full-time commitments to struggle and support them. Not just graduate students, not just the well-meaning radical whites who in so many cases have ascended to union leadership based on struggles of poor Latino or Black people. I'm not necessarily saying that we need some kind of centralized organization, but we have to find ways to sustain people in struggle who in fact are the same people who fight in the streets. And I don't think any national organization like DSA can come close to doing this. We also need a political strategy that bridges the demands of the last cycle, social democratic demands of the last cycle, with the extreme economic conditions of the near future. I mean, millions of Americans went to bed one night in February or March. You know, it's 2020. They woke up the next morning, it was 1932. Okay. And the extremity of conditions cannot be exaggerated. And this requires, you know, very radical, determined organizing that's not constrained by what mainstream Democrats will think of it, and does not depend on the Democratic Party, though it can feed the Democratic Party to the extent, you know, electing more people like AOC and so on.
Thank you so much. I have Josku next on the list. Josku, are you there?
Yes,
Josku
can
is
you hear me?
a student in our department.
Yes, I am also, thanks for Mike for the speech. And also I am an international, I am not a US citizen. So I want to ask something I can relate to your title of the discussion, the trench warfare, and we are mainly discussing about there is a hegemonically the something like the bourgeoisie or the elites are moving over and over with the NAFTA, with the gerrymandering, to the constant barrage of the against the working class is going on. But my main question is I am thinking like you against Devika. I will say Democrats and the Republicans are the same thing, representing the elites. But why the working classes want to more punish the Democrats, and something like seeing all these changes are something like done by the kind of Democrats, both of them is done all the things, and also related to the same thing. Apart from the something like trench warfare, the classical institutions of the working class, like the trade unions, are decreasing, but at the same time, kind of maneuver fights are going on, like the BLM or something like this illegal strike of the West Virginia teachers and etc. Bernie Sanders also something like not trying to go around something Democratic National Convention. So the main systems of the something like classical institutions of the working class is decreasing. So the working class is trying to find a different ways to something like a fight back. But why it is something like seen as an like an it is the problems the Democrats why the something like they don't want to punish the Republicans. It is the something like a main dichotomy for me is going on. Thank you.
It's an interesting article today, and I'm trying to remember whether it's on Common Greens or it's on, but it's arguing that in fact the Biden administration has already decided to do what Obama did and not investigate or punish the crimes of the previous administration. This is astounding. There is these days a desperate shortage of sociological analysis on the left, of class analysis. Let me give you one example, which is the phenomena of Generation X and Z. Because in the last decade, 15 years, we've seen a huge increase in number of Latino, Black, Asian kids going to college, first generation college kids, whose parents have made huge sacrifices to get them there. And they carry the burden of the expectations that have been invested in them, only to discover when they graduate that there are no jobs. You know, you can work for Uber, you can deliver groceries for, you know, Amazon. You can maybe make out, scratch together a living doing something on the internet. But this is the first generation where college graduates and the aspirant middle class have suffered such downward mobility, combined with the, you know, frontal assault on the rights of people of color, voting rights, women's rights, and so on. This is fused together, and it's given a material momentum, a material basis to things like the Sanders campaign and so on. Because people realize that the future has been looted in advance for them. Now, I have two generation Ys, I guess, or Zs, that's what it's called. Forgive me, I'm just an old codger. Still in the house. My two younger kids are still in high school. They identify with their mother is Mexican. And when I talk to them about politics, I'm constantly finding myself, I feel like I'm a Menshevik addressing an audience of Bolsheviks. And while that might not be surprising for kids coming from a kind of red middle class household like mine, what's astonishing are their friends. They go to San Diego High, inner city high school. Their friends are all kids from immigrant blue collar families, Mexican, Somali, and so on. These kids are radical to a degree that I had to keep pinching myself that I'm not waking up in a dream. And they're absolutely intransigent. They share an agreement that only profound social change can liberate their future. And they don't see that. And I could not budge any of them to vote for Biden, making all the usual arguments. So I feel that the left really has to contour itself to the socioeconomic dimensions of what's happening, to people's material situations, and this huge capacity for struggle and radical action that has emerged. About 12 years ago, I was on Bill Moyer's show. Bill is the last American socialist. Like I was, one of those fishes that have survived from the Cretaceous or something. Next thing I know, you turn around and more people under 30 think positive of socialism than they do of capitalism. But this cannot be simply a molecular process of assembling actions and collectives and building coalitions. There needs to be a large group of people that share a common strategy and direction and orientation to class-based organizing and to the kind of radical solutions that are no longer, a handful was standing in a corner trying to sell you a newspaper, arguing for the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now people want, they want socialist, at least social democratic reforms, because, they understand it concretely and vividly in their own lives. But again, who am I? I'm an old codger, still living in the analog world of the 20th century. And I would love to hear, I wish we had more time, I'd love to hear from the younger people out there what they think about these things.
Thank you so much. I have Adam Abu Baker next on the list, also a PhD student in the economics department. Adam, are you there?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for your talk. I'm a PhD student here at UMass, and I guess I'm broadly interested in the broader implications of your criticisms of the Biden campaign for, interested in the implications for left strategy. So, I see it as legitimate and worthwhile, of course, to criticize the Biden campaign's failure to animate the traditional base in South Texas. But I was wondering, is there any clear evidence that Biden could have run a more successful campaign at the national level by pursuing a strategy other than campaigning to make the election a kind of referendum on Trump and his handling of the COVID crisis? And I ask this in part because I think it's relevant to the question of why so many voters in the primaries and Democratic primaries shied away from Bernie, even in a moment when he was, relatively ascendant, commanding significant campaign resources and with a lot of momentum. And primary voters shied away from him in favor of a guy who was broadly seen as a spent force, or yesterday's man, to quote Jacobin magazine. So in other words, I was wondering, does your critique of the Biden campaign's performance in South Texas boil down to having a weak ground game rather than having a weak national strategy?
No, it's not just a matter of strategy at all. It's the fact of what the Democratic Party needed to build and still needs to build in South Texas is a much larger grassroots organization of local people. It needs to listen to what they're saying. And Sanders seemed to do that, which is why he was so successful. But remember, you talk about Biden as a spent force. He was a spent force in the primaries until the vote in South Carolina and until all the other primary candidates rallied to his side, with the exception of Julian Castro, who supported Elizabeth Warren. And talk about the Black votes supporting the center of the party. The same people who voted for him in North Carolina, in South Carolina, when polled, overwhelmingly supported Medicare for all. In the South, the civil rights movement has built very effective and dynastic democratic political machines. And older voters, particularly those who live in the worst periods of Jim Crow, are loyal to those machines. Young Black people across the country evinced different choices than their elders. And amongst Latinos, it was quite fantastic. I mean, you look at Nevada and California, where Sanders got 70% of the Latino vote. And there were like hundreds, thousands of young Latino activists out there working, but also swayed their families because his program corresponded so completely with what people understand to be their priorities. But there's no possibility whatsoever that the Democrats, a political party that runs on populist programs sometimes, but is dictated to by its own internal power structures, by Silicon Valley and Hollywood and investment bankers, can ever really be the voice of ordinary people. It's a different struggle, demands different institutions. I'm not one of these people who believes that you never vote for a Democrat. I think if offered the choice to select your enemy, you should do it. And for me, that's what voting for Biden was. I'd rather have the Clinton, Obama Democrats as an enemy than Donald Trump.
Thank you so much, Professor Davis. Officially, we have arrived at the end of our session, but if we still have questions, and but I don't want to overburden you, so it's really up to you whether you would like to continue or whether we should call it a wonderful session.
I have the time, though. It's embarrassing when I drone on and on. So people want to make comments or some more questions. That's fine with me. Then
how about we collect the remaining questions? How would you feel about that? Or do you prefer to answer them one by one? You prefer one by one?
If you can efficiently collect them, the questions and give me a resume, that would be fine.
Okay, I try my best. So I'm relying on all of you who still would like to ask questions to please put them in a very simple and concise fashion in the interest of time and in the interest of still getting through the stack. So I have still in the stack David Bond, Gustav Lester, Swati Birla, and Stephanie Atta. In the interest of having some more female voices in the mix here, I'd like to start with Stephanie Atta. Please ask a short and concise question. Thank you.
Oh, hey. So yeah, I'm a PhD student here in the department. I'm also from San Bernardino, California, represent. So I really appreciate your work, Professor Davis, on the history and the politics of SoCal. My question is basically, amongst the left, we tend to see like a lot of organizing tends to be very insular, like we only tend to talk to ourselves. And I guess my question is like, how do we reach out to those people in our country who are poor, working class, and have voted for Trump because they rightly so see the Democratic Party as being like so corrupt? Like, do we speak to them like blatantly, like that we are anti-capitalist? Do we co-opt their language and talk about like jobs and, you know, economic recovery and economic growth? Yeah, those are my questions.
Thank you.
You're a homegirl from San Bernardino?
Hell yeah.
I was born in San Bernardino. We lived in Fontana, but I was born in San Bernardino. So, you know, all power to you.
Hell yeah.
Okay.
I think we should ignore the Democrats for a while and talk about necessary struggles, fights already going on that we should be investing our time in, and we should be trying to tie together. I think there's really a broad consensus now that we need a more encompassing class-based strategy. And one of the social forces I would look to, because they've played not just a heroic role in the pandemic, but they've been so deeply politicized by the pandemic, are healthcare workers. Not just Nurses United, but, you know, janitors, nurses, aides, everything. Because what's going on behind the pandemic is that so many local hospitals are actually closing down. The insurance industry has made a fortune out of it because they're not paying for the ordinary visits and cancer treatments and stuff they normally do. The health sector is in real crisis in terms of jobs. Public health on a county and state level was totally gutted by the 2008 recession. lost 60,000 jobs, which has never been replaced. So this is a very important front of struggle. And of course, healthcare workers and their vast majority support Medicare for all, even doctors, which still astonishes me, because I grew up in a period where the American Medical Association was to the right of Nixon and totally opposed to anything like social medicine. But the situation is very, very different today. This is a very dynamic sector, as well as the organizing campaigns against Amazon and so on. But I'm only touching the tip of the iceberg here. I'm sure you could name a half dozen other struggles occurring in Native America, rural America, union organizing campaigns. This is where the energy needs to be invested, but it needs to have an ongoing dialogue about strategy in the interrelationship of struggles. And it needs to be non-negotiable. I have a kind of extreme position about this. I think we should always be the party of the necessary, not of the pragmatic, not of the realistic. You know, what are the minimum things people need to survive in this country and have a decent way of life and to achieve greater equality, and should never surrender those. I thought it was really crushing when Sanders negotiators and these negotiations they had with Biden camp after Super Tuesday ceded Medicare for all. That should have never happened. There was no need for that. The kind of intransigence that Trump supporters and Republicans show is not a bad political quality when it involves these really existential questions, when it's about people's futures. And many people's futures now are futures of poverty and even more extreme marginalization. There are tremendous energies to be mobilized out there. Yeah, we should, still support our team inside the Congress, but it's far less important now than to support people in struggle, and for the activists in those struggles to basically escalate the conversation about where they're headed and how to unify movements.
Thank you so much. I would suggest that I just collect the remaining questions and then post them all to you, and you can pick whatever aspect you would still like to pick up on. How does this sound? Yeah?
Whatever.
Okay. So there's a question from Swati Birla from the sociology department. She's saying, there seems to be a shift in political language, and emergent candidates say in places like Puerto Rico this election, given the leaning towards institutional politics in US, what spaces in Texas did you see where social movements are carving out interesting modes of crafting new political demands and modes of doing politics?
You know what's interesting is that very progressive ballot initiatives, state initiatives, in some cases municipal initiatives, won in areas where Trump was the presidential victor, like the $15 minimum wage won by 60% in Florida. There were similar ballot measures across the country. And people on those issues voted differently than they did in their presidential choices, which is why I believe there's this considerable minority of the Trump vote that is voting for economics, not because they're full-fledged members of the Trump nation. California, however, is the counter example, where 3 or 4 very important progressive initiatives went down in flames, despite the fact that I think Biden probably won the state by 70%, which is something that activists in the state are looking keenly at now. part of the problem was that they were just overwhelmed by money. People didn't understand the issues. There's just this, huge onslaught of ads depicting progressive measures like upholding the state law, the recognized app-based employees as, as workers, or preserving property tax exemptions only for homeowners. These were, should have been no problem, but we underestimated not just the money behind them, but also the power structure of the Democratic Party in really democratic states like California, where the big givers, again, Silicon Valley and in Hollywood, have different economic interests than do most of the working people who are Democrats here.
Thank you so much. David Bond, are you still there?
Yep. I can ask my question very quickly. Thank you so much for the very incisive and as always, almost prophetic voice of the present. I heard a brief sort of description of this divergence between the aesthetics of working class, the kinds of people we think of when we think of the working class, Carhartt wearing, John Deere tractors, big trucks, and the kind of inhabited realities that are much more complex and diverse. And somehow I think when we think of class, we're thinking of the wrong people. And I heard it in your description a little bit of South Texas, and I think it was gestured towards in the Rust Belt. And I'm wondering if you could just sort of tell us more about this. I know where I'm at in southern Vermont, near New York, the people that still have jobs in the factories, which are very, very few, are at the very top of the income bracket. And it's home healthcare workers, dollar store employees, and gig economy folks who comprise the working class. Yet when the media comes in to try to interview and get the voice of the white working class, who do they go to? They go to factory workers making six figures. So I'm wondering if you could just sort of talk about this difference of the aesthetics of the working class that we have and the actual realities of what's going on with working people today.
Yeah, this conflation of working class with white workers and white male workers has been out of control. And it's obviously something we all reject. But the media keeps playing into this. One of the things I found absolutely fascinating about looking at local level elections and social dynamics is that in so many industrial areas, or former industrial areas, the biggest employer right now is healthcare. 17 and one half of Americans work in the healthcare sector, interpreted liberally. This sector, of course, is, faced, the storm surge and continues to face it. That's why I attach so much importance to this. But if you begin to think about work in the future, you see why Biden's sole job program, green energy jobs, is not going to create millions of jobs, or it's not going to offset the losses to automation and probably to reduce consumer demand in the country. I was once a trucker. Truckers are facing an extinction event, if we believe all the stories that you read in the business thread. Many of them are the face of rural America, keeping the family farm going by spending 285 days a year out on the road. This is not a constituency that automatically should be yielded to Trump or Republicans. In Los Angeles, there's been a 20-year organizing campaign at the port. The truckers, independent owner-operators who haul containers from the port, overwhelmingly Latino immigrants. And have succeeded in changing their identity from being small businessmen to seeing the world as a collective, and have created an important union. We should never accept artificial boundaries. Although the Democrats have this terrible tradition of, when they face a majority on the other side, just to fold up their tents and go home. Here in San Diego County, where I grew up in the East County, Republican East County, until recently, unless you could show that you have $60,000 or $65,000 in contributions, the county committee and the unions won't pay any attention to you. I don't think there's any case in the country where Republicans just sit away seats like that and refuse to organize people. And I think it's probably a established sociological fact that where you've had successful struggles like union campaigns, the politics follow along. There's nothing like a strike or nothing like experiencing the camaraderie of workers in motion to leave a deep and lasting imprint on people's lives. I don't know if that really answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Davis. The last two questions have been considered to already have been answered by your previous replies. So this is your chance to still give a last word if you would like to. Any last thoughts or?
Well, just one thing that I left out, which I think is important in the way we analyze the election results and make sense of the social topography of this country, which is the importance of the exurbs, which I mentioned earlier. It's gentrification of rural counties on the edge of metropolitan districts, which basically seceded from a common life with a diversity of other people. People voted with their feet to live in homogeneous white enclaves. But it's also a global phenomenon. Some years ago, my friend Dan Monk and I edited a book called Evil Paradises, looking at the phenomena across the world. We had some brilliant contributors writing about places like Egypt or Hong Kong or Central America, that everywhere the rich are creating these fortified luxury spaces in which they can live. This is actually happening on a huge scale. In China, developing gated communities for the upper middle classes on an enormous scale. And that's something that has to be factored into our understanding of why you get such large blocks of people like the 40% Trump hardcore that I talked about, because they're transforming the world around them in order to avoid contact with other people. A walled world in which every point, every day, their opinions and beliefs are confirmed. But in walled worlds like that, people can go crazy. Extremism is an absolute condition of survival, for instance, in jails and in prisons. And a portion of the American upper middle class is becoming more and more extreme, as I indicated by quoting from this poll of Republicans. And the idea of civil war, ridiculous. Or is it? We have to think, long and hard about these things. because there's every reason to believe that political violence in this country, well, it didn't happen on election day. I think surprised many of us, but political violence in this country is going to keep increasing. I mean, the impoverization of people that's occurred during the pandemic will continue. People will riot. Why not? Okay, people will fight back in the streets. And their antagonists, the Republican middle classes, will fight back as well. This is a slippery slope that we need to acknowledge in a realistic manner. Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you so much, Professor Davis, for taking the time to share your deep analysis, for sharing your caution and sharing your vision for organizing with us. This has been really, really enlightening. Thank you so much. And I think I'm speaking on behalf of the whole department in thanking you. And I would also like to thank all of you who have asked questions, helping to get this discussion going. And in particular, I would like to thank the two student volunteers, Deba Manu-Das and Pedro Almeida, who in the background have been helping me to run this workshop throughout the term. Thank you so much to the two of you. This is the last workshop of this term, but we will resume our workshop next term, and I hope you all stay tuned. Thank you so much, Professor Davis. A recording of this seminar will be available on YouTube, so please share widely. Thank you so much, Professor Davis.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you. I'm stopping the recording now.